Comment vous allez? Là maintenant, on est au niveau de la section 19. Donc, c'est sur une section de 53 minutes. Mais comme j'ai accéléré la vidéo, on va le faire un peu plus rapidement. Puis, on va continuer jusqu'à, je pense qu'on pourra s'arrêter à, on pourra s'arrêter à Node.js, hein. On va faire de section 19 à la section 23. Allons-y.
All right, guys, now in this module, I want to introduce you to the most popular JavaScript library, and it's of course jQuery. Now, there's thousands of JavaScript libraries out there, and in later modules, we're going to be exploring some of these libraries. But none of these libraries have been used or downloaded as often as jQuery. So why is that? Well, let's take a look at some code that we've written before. So if we break this code down, essentially what it's doing is it's looking inside the entire document and it's querying for all the elements that have the selector of button. So all of the HTML button elements. And then we're going to add an event listener that is going to detect for clicks on the button. And when it does get detected, then we're going to run the callback function to again look through the document and query for the selector of H1. And then we're going to change the style, namely the color of that H1 to the color red. And we're using a for loop to traverse through all of the buttons on our web page in order to add this event listener and this behavior to all of those buttons. So we wrote this code in our drum kit, and this is pure JavaScript. And it's actually a little bit crazy if you really think about it. In order to do something relatively simple, why does it require so many lines of code? And who's going to take care of all our joint pain from all this typing? Now, you know how sometimes you have these thoughts and you moan and complain about it a little bit, and then you kind of get over yourself, right? But not this guy. This is John Resick. And he was really unhappy with the way that JavaScript worked in web development. He was really frustrated by how unnecessarily complex and lengthy the code had to be. So whereas most of us probably had that thought and we promptly forgot about it, not this guy. John decided that he was going to write a library that would do exactly the same as all of this JavaScript code, but it was as short and as sweet as this. And so jQuery was born. It's a library, so a bunch of code that somebody else wrote that you can incorporate into your own projects and use to improve your own projects or to make your life simply a lot easier. Now, we've come across libraries before. Previously, we created websites and we incorporated the Bootstrap library in order to be able to incorporate code that somebody else wrote in the Bootstrap library to make our lives much easier and make it much quicker to improve the user interface of our website. Now, what jQuery allows you to do is take a line of code, say this, where we're looking through the DOM of our website, we're selecting the document, and we're querying for the selector H1. So we're looking for the H1 element in our web page. Now, if we were to use the jQuery library, then we can get rid of all of that and simply say jQuery parentheses H1. And if you want to be even shorter, the shorthand way to write jQuery is simply a $sign. So dollar parentheses H1 does exactly the same as document.querySelector parentheses quotation marks H1. And you can see that it's a lot shorter, and that'll make our JavaScript code a lot easier to read, a lot easier to debug, and a lot faster to write. So we don't have to end up breaking our fingers by typing so much JavaScript code. All right, so I've spoken so much about how awesome it is. How can we get it and incorporate jQuery into our websites to start benefiting from all of its awesomeness? Well, if you head over to jQuery.com, you can see that just like Bootstrap, you can download all the jQuery code files through their download page, or you can simply use a CDN. Now, previously, we explained what CDNs or content delivery networks were and how they work. So if you're at all confused about this, then take a look back at the Bootstrap module when we talked about this in detail. Now, the most popular option across the web is to use Google's CDN. And as we mentioned before, the beauty of using a popular CDN is that if a user has been to another website that uses the same CDN to fetch the jQuery library, then they'll likely have it already cached and saved in their browser, which means that when they want to load up your website, they won't have to fetch a fresh copy of jQuery. They've already got it loaded and ready to go, giving your website a much faster load rate. So we're going to be using the latest version of jQuery, 3.3.1. Now, at the time when you're watching this video, it might just be that it'll be 3.3.2 or a larger number, but I want you to get the latest version with the script tag. and we're going to copy it, and we're going to create a new project. Now, I want you to go into your web development project folder and create a new project, and we're going to call this jQuery. And then we're going to drag and drop this into Atom, and then we're going to hit A in order to create a new file. And this is going to be index.html, as well as styles.css, and also our index.js. All right, so we've got all three files lined up, and now let's head into our HTML, put in our boilerplate, and we're simply going to call our website title just jQuery. We're going to hit save, and now I want you to pause the video and incorporate our CSS as well as JavaScript into this HTML web page. So pause the video now and see if you remember how and where to do that. As we said before, our style sheets should go into the head section of our web page. So in here, just below the title, I'm going to create a link that has a relationship of style sheet, and the href is going to be styles.css. Now let's hit save, and let's just test this to make sure that it's definitely working. So we're just going to change the background color of our body to red. And now if I copy the full path of my index.html and paste it in here, there we go. All right, so our CSS is working and linked up. Next step is to include and link up our JavaScript. Now, if you've completed the last module, then you would know that preferably you should include your JavaScript at the end of your website, just before the closing tag of the body. So over here, we're going to include a script with an external source, and the source is going to be index.js. We're going to hit save, and we're going to include some JavaScript code in here just to check that it's working. And if so, we'll just send an alert that says working. So now if I hit refresh, and I get an alert as well as my background being red, so I know that everything is all linked up and I can safely delete these bits of code. Now in our index.html, I'm going to include a number of HTML elements. So firstly, I'm going to have an h1 that just says hello. And then I'm going to have a whole bunch of buttons. And the buttons are just going to say click me. But I'm going to copy this and paste it so that we have 5 buttons in total as well as an h1. All right, so now let's hit save. And I'm going to use the same code that I showed you in the last lesson to write some jQuery that's going to change the text color of our H1 to red. So we're going to start off with the $, which is short for jQuery. So you can either write it like this, or you can write it like this. They both do exactly the same thing in jQuery. Almost everybody will be using the $, as a lot of the reason why we're using jQuery is to shorten our code and do less typing. Okay, so I'm going to target the H1 in our document, and I'm going to change its CSS, namely the color property, to red. All right, so now we've got our jQuery code. We're going to be going through all of this code much, much deeper later on. But now all you need to know is that we're using this to select the H1 on our web page, and we're changing its CSS, namely the color property, to red. If I refresh my website, you'll see that nothing has happened because we need to incorporate jQuery in order for this to be valid. Because right now, if you open up the console, you can see that it's telling you that the $, is not defined on JavaScript line number 2. Now that's because the $, if you remember, is jQuery. So if we don't have any jQuery, then it's not really going to work. So let's incorporate it. Now head back to the Google hosted libraries page and copy this script tag. And we're going to paste that above our JavaScript script tag. And now if you hit save and refresh, then you can see that we have no more errors in our console, and the text is now being turned red using our jQuery code inside our index.js. Now the position where you place your jQuery script tag is really important. For example, if we placed it below our index.js, then you'll see that it no longer works and it no longer colors our text red. And we get the same problem that the $, is not defined in our index.js on line 2. Now, the reason is because if you remember, the browser will read the code from top to bottom, and the first thing that it will try to process is our index.js. So it heads over here, and it tries to make sense and carry out the instructions in here. And when it sees that $, at this point, it hasn't got hold of the jQuery library yet. So it still doesn't know what this $, and all this short code is all about. So that's why, if you're going to use jQuery inside your JavaScript code, then make sure that you place the script tag above it so that by the time it gets into this file, it already knows what the $, is and how all of these shortening methods work. Now, the other way that it might mess up is that if you had both of these script tags inside the head section of your website, then when you refresh your website, you'll notice that, again, it doesn't work. And in this case, it's not even giving you a proper error. And you have to be really careful about including the CDN for our jQuery library in the head section of your website. Because what might happen is that before we've actually finished loading up the entire jQuery library, our index.js might already be trying to access it. So one of the ways that you can safeguard against this is to check whether if our jQuery library is ready. And we do that by using the $sign to select our document. And then we use the ready method, and we have a callback function in here. And that means that once our document is ready, then it's going to call this code. So now if we hit save and we refresh, then you can see our code now works because we waited until our jQuery library has finished loading, and then we access the H1 to change its color. Now, when you come across websites, you'll often see this line of code. But another way of doing exactly the same thing is simply to include our scripts at the end of our website, right before the closing body tag. And this does exactly the same thing as this line of code. So when you see me writing jQuery code in the coming lessons, then you'll notice that I don't use that ready method because I always have my jQuery script at the end of my website. And that way, I only try to tap into and manipulate my HTML elements after they've been loaded up and rendered on screen. Now, for the inquisitive ones amongst you, you might have copied this URL where our jQuery library resides and tried to take a look at it. And if you did, this is what you would see. It looks like a huge mess. But this is essentially the minified version of the jQuery library. And you might notice that it looks very similar from the Bootstrap CDN that we used previously. When you copy the URL there and paste it and load it in your browser, then you can see, again, you have this huge mess of code. Now, what exactly is all of this? Let's take a section of this and copy it. And inside Atom, I'm going to open a new page. I'm going to show you what this minification does. So essentially, we've still got the same Bootstrap code. So in the case of Bootstrap, then it is CSS. And in the case of jQuery, then it's JavaScript code. But essentially, all of the spaces, the new lines, the comments have been removed from the file to try and reduce its size. But you can see that as I've been combing through this and separating out these lines into the familiar formatting that we're used to, then you can see that it's just CSS code. And this is simply just JavaScript code. And in fact, if you head over to minifier.org, which is a way of converting your JavaScript or CSS code to a minified version. Now, to test it out, I've got our index.js from our DrumKit code. And at the top, I'm going to add a comment. This is a comment. And you can see that it's got a lot of spaces, new lines, new paragraphs, but we're going to copy its entirety by just hitting Command or Control A and then Command or Control C. And then we're going to take it over to our minifier and we're going to paste that in. And now we're going to select JavaScript and hit minify. And you can see that it's just crunched everything together and got rid of our comments. So now you can see that our original script was 1,539 bytes. Our minified script is only 1,113 bytes. So we have gained 426 bytes, making our file smaller and therefore quicker for our users to load. And this is exactly the reason why we minify our JavaScript or our CSS, because all of this code has to be loaded up by your user's browser. Now, depending on their internet speed, that may take a short time or a long time. Now, because the browser doesn't care about tabs, indents, spaces, and comments, it completely ignores all of it. There's no point asking the user to load up all of this unnecessary information. And by minifying it, we get rid of those things and make our website load much faster. So if you download the jQuery library straight up, then you'll see something that looks a bit like this. Now, as with all libraries, they'll come with a standard version that is human readable, and they'll also have a minified version that's just intended for the browser. And this is so that you can customize the code if you wish, and then minify it yourself, or if you don't want to do any customization, then simply to just drop the jQuery file into your project. All right, so in the next lesson, we're actually going to be getting down and dirty and actually exploring all the things that you can do with jQuery, starting by selecting elements. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, the most basic thing we need to do when we're creating our websites is to select the elements in our web page in order to manipulate it at a later date. Now, we saw that we can do this in JavaScript by saying something like document.querySelector, and inside here, we would add the selector that we want to select, right? So, for example, if we wanted the H1, then we can simply say querySelector H1. Now, if we were to write this in jQuery, then we can remove all of this part and instead only have the $sign, which is short for jQuery. So now we're using a jQuery method to select our H1, and you can see how much shorter it is. Now, this works very similarly to querySelector in the sense that inside the parentheses, we're specifying the CSS selector that we would use if we were to select our elements in CSS. And this is because it's the most flexible, the most adaptable, and also can be very specific. So, for example, it allows us to say things like we want the H1 that has a class of title, or we want the H1 that's nested inside a div with the ID of header. And that works exactly the same. There's no changes there. But what the jQuery selector allows us to do is when we're trying to select all of our buttons, if you remember from previously, we had to say something like document.querySelectorAll, and then we would select the button in here. Now with jQuery, the $sign again replaces all of this, and it will select all of the buttons on screen. And there's no difference between selecting one or selecting many. Now, previously, we briefly saw that we can manipulate the CSS style of a selected element by simply using the .css method from jQuery. So, for example, we can select our H1 and we can say .css, and we can add the CSS property that we want to change. So, for example, the color, and our second input is the value for that property. So we're going to change it to green this time. And now if I hit save and refresh, then you can see our H1 has been selected and the CSS color property has been changed to green. Now, this method is really flexible. For example, you can get the current value of the CSS property by simply having the name of the property in some quotation marks as a string inside the method. And now we can console log the value of this. And when we refresh our website, you'll see that we get the RGB, the red, green, black value of our H1's color, which is black. And if we wanted something like, say, font size and refresh, then you can see that the current H1 has a font size of 32. And we're getting that by using the .css method. So remember with this method that if you have a single property in it, then you're getting the value of it. And if you have two properties in it, then you're setting the value. Now, as we said before, changing something that's related to the style inside our JavaScript code is not that great. It feels a little bit dirty. And that's because we need to separate our concerns. Keep our JavaScript code all about behavior, keep our style code all about the appearance, and keep our HTML all about content. So how can we do that? Well, what if instead of adding our CSS by using the CSS method, we had a class inside our style sheet? Let's call it big title. And this is going to have a font size of 10 rem. And it's also going to have a color of yellow. And finally, we're going to make the font family cursive. All right. So now that we've got this class inside our style sheet, we can use jQuery to add that class to our selected element. So we're selecting our H1, and by writing .add class, and then inside the parentheses, we'll add the name of the class, which let's just remind ourselves was called big-title. Big-title. And now if we hit save and refresh, then you can see that we've added all of those awful looking CSS to our H1. And this is a much better way of separating our behavior from our styles. Now, just as you can add class, you can also remove class. So now that we've added this horrendous yellow color, we can select our H1 and use the .remove class method to remove this big title class from our H1. And you can see once I run that, then all of those styles that belong to the big title CSS rule disappears. Now, if you wanted to add or remove multiple classes, let's say we add another one called margin 50. And in this one, we simply add a margin of 50 pixels, hit save, and now inside our index.js, in order to add multiple classes, all we need to do is just to include them inside the same set of quotation marks, but with a space in between. So our second class was called margin-50, and now we're selecting our H1 and we're adding all of the classes. So that's big title as well as margin 50. So if we hit save and refresh, you can see that we're getting both classes applied to our H1. Now, another really useful method from jQuery is we can see whether or not if our element has a particular class. So we can select our H1 and then we can say dot has class, and we're going to query for the margin 50 class. And now if we hit enter, then you can see that it'll give you a true or false Boolean, depending on whether or not the element does indeed have that class applied. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can use jQuery to manipulate not just styles, but also text. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in order to change the text of a selected element using jQuery, there's two ways of going about this. One is you can simply say, select an element, then dot text, and inside the parentheses, you'll add the new text that you want it to say. So this will change our hello to a goodbye. As we mentioned before, when we use jQuery to select an HTML element, it selects all of the elements that match that selector on your web page. So if we were to say dot text on the buttons, then when we refresh our page, you can see that every single button gets its text updated by simply selecting for all the elements that match this criteria, and then we're using the dot text method to change the text that's inside those buttons, which is this part here. Now, if you remember, when we learnt how to do this using plain old vanilla JavaScript, we also had something called inner HTML. And using inner HTML, we were able to not just update text, but we were also able to add HTML. But as we're using jQuery, it's a little bit shorter. So it's simply .html. And inside here, we can add some tags. Say, for example, if we wanted to add the EM tag to make our text emphasized, or rather italicized. Now, when we update our website, you can see that the HTML is also taken into consideration because we're using the .html method instead of simply the .text method, which will interpret everything in between the quotation marks as pure text and ignores all of the HTML tags. Now, by this point, you would have noticed that most of the things that you do with jQuery are implemented using methods, and we're accessing it through the dot notation. Now, remember how when we were learning about methods and functions, we used it a lot to shorten our code and reduce repetition. Well, this is pretty much how jQuery works. If you take a look at the library, then you'll notice that jQuery is completely written in JavaScript. But it has all of these methods that shorten the code that we need to write and makes working with JavaScript to create our websites much, much quicker, much easier, and reduces repetitive strain injury from typing so much. So I hope that you also realize that without understanding how vanilla JavaScript works, then jQuery just seems like complete magic. So it's really important that you needed to get a good foundation in JavaScript before we start introducing you to essentially what most web developers will use when they're writing JavaScript, which is doing it through jQuery or another library. I hope that by this point you've already realized that this library can make your life as a developer so much easier with less things to type and more intuitive syntax. But in the next lesson, we're going to dig into jQuery even further, and we're going to learn how we can manipulate attributes using jQuery. So for all of that, stay tuned. I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can use jQuery to manipulate text in our web page. But in this lesson, we're going to look at how we can also use it to manipulate attributes. Now, attributes are things such as, for example, if you had an image, then it would have a source, right? So, for example, drum.png. And if you had a anchor tag, then that might be the href, right? HTTPS www.google.com. So if we wanted to be able to get and set these attributes on the fly using JavaScript and jQuery, then we have a really simple method that we can tap into. So we can select our image and we can use attr for the attribute method. Then inside the parentheses, we're going to give the name of the attribute that we want. So for example, for our image, that will be the src or the source. And now I can console log this result. And if I hit save and go to our website and refresh, you'll see that we failed to load our resource because in our project, we currently don't actually have an image. But if we wanted to diagnose this, then we could have simply used .attribute to get our source printed out, and we can see that it's a file called drum.png, which we clearly do not have in the current project folder. Now, in addition to getting the value of the attribute, you can also set the value of the attribute. So for example, let's select our anchor tag this time, and we're going to use the attr method, attribute method again. And this time we're going to get the value of the href attribute, but we're also going to set it. So that's the second input of this method. If there is a second input, then we're going to set it to that. And if there isn't one, then we're going to get the value of the attribute. So let's say that we've decided that we want to look after the underdogs and we're going to direct people towards yahoo.com instead of Google. I'm not sure if anybody uses Yahoo anymore, but let's give that a go. So this code will select all of the anchor tags on our website and change the href attribute to yahoo.com, whereas previously it was google.com. And I'll give that anchor tag a value of search. So now if we hit refresh and we click on our anchor tag, then it should take us to Yahoo. Whereas without this line of code, then it'll take us to the original destination, which was google.com. Now, remember that a class is also an HTML attribute. So that means that if we had our h1, let's just apply those awful styles again, big title and margin 50. So class equals big dash title and margin dash 50. Then if we refresh our website and go into our console and we select our h1 to get its class attribute, then you can see that it'll print out all of the classes that are currently applied to the h1. All right, so the next thing that we want to explore is how do you add event listeners to our HTML elements using jQuery? Well, as you'll come to see, this is way, way easier than using vanilla JavaScript. And let's start by adding an event listener to our h1. So we're going to go into our index.js and we're going to, again, use jQuery by typing the $, and then we're going to wrap the thing that we're looking for, which is the h1. And now all we need to do is say .click, and that will add an event listener and call this callback function once it detects a click. So inside here, we're again going to target the h1, and then we're going to change its CSS from that horrible yellow color to maybe a slightly nicer color. Let's try purple. All right, now let's hit save and refresh. And once I click on the h1, bam, looks a lot nicer, right? Now, the other pain that we had previously is that if we wanted to add an event listener to all 5 buttons, we had to write a for loop if we only had JavaScript in our toolset. So we had to write something like for variable I equals 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. And then inside the for loop, we searched through the document for query selector all to select all of the buttons. And the selector is, of course, button. And then we used this index I to add event listener. And then the event listener that we were looking for was the click listener. And then once that was detected, we call the callback function and we target the document query selector, not all, just query selector for the h1. .style, .color equals purple. All right, so this is our code without JavaScript. Just make sure that there's no typos like what I've got here. And remember that Atom is here to help. So you'll notice that the color of a function that it doesn't know about is kind of this light blue. Whereas if it knows about it, then it colors it kind of turquoisey, slightly more green. Admittedly, the difference is not large. All right, so let's fix this typo. And that changes the color highlighting. And now if I hit save and refresh, if I click on one of these buttons or any of these buttons, it will change my text to purple. Now, let me show you how much easier it is to do this using jQuery. So we're going to select our buttons by using the jQuery selector. And then we're going to say .click, just as we did before. And then we're going to bind our callback function to it. And we're going to update our h1 to change its color to purple. So you might notice that we're not bothering with a for loop here, because by selecting for button, jQuery will look through your website and select all of the buttons. And if you combine that with a click method, then it will add this click listener to all the buttons that it finds without you having to go through it using a for loop. So let's delete this and hit save. And let me show you how it works exactly the same, even though our code is now a lot shorter. So aside from the click listener, we can also bind a key press event listener. So for example, if we go into our index.html and we add an input and we hit save, then you can see that we've now got a text box. Now, if we want to start detecting for keystrokes inside that text box, then we can use jQuery to do that by targeting the input and adding the key press event. And once a key press is detected, then we want to log that event inside our console. So we'll just use the console log to show us what the event.key property was. So which key got pressed. So now if I hit save and refresh, if I go in here and I type something like, I don't know, K, then you can see that we've got K showing up here, or T, or D, or hit enter, anything you wish. And that is how we can detect it. Now, if you wanted to do what we did in the drum kit, whereby you're adding the key press event listener to the entire document, it's as easy as either changing this to the body that we're selecting, or we can simply just delete the quotation marks and put document in here, which selects the entire document. So now, once I click inside the website, then you can see that my keystrokes are also being logged. Now, as a challenge, I want you to update the code that we wrote just now so that whenever I press a key inside our website, it gets shown inside the H1. So pause the video and see if you can complete that challenge. All right, so that shouldn't have been too difficult because all we need to do is instead of logging the event.key, we just need to select our H1 and change its text using the text method to the event.key. And we looked at this in previous lessons where we looked at how we can manipulate text using jQuery. So if that's at all unfamiliar, then make sure that you remind yourself by going back there. All right, now let's hit save and refresh. And you can see that whenever I type anything in my keyboard, it gets shown up in the H1. So the next thing I want to show you is that instead of using .keypress or .click functions, there's actually an even more flexible way of adding an event listener. We can simply use the method on. And this takes two parameters. The first one is the event that you're looking to listen for. And that can be any of the events that we had access to by using JavaScript. So for example, let's look for something like mouse over. So we can select our H1 and we're going to detect for mouse over events. And when it does happen, then this is the second parameter, which is going to be the callback function. And when we do detect a mouse over event on our H1, then we'll change our H1's color to purple. All right, let's hit save and refresh. And now we can mouse over our H1 to change its CSS. Now, if you wanted to, you can of course also detect for click instead of mouse over. So click events, or any of the events that are listed in the MDN docs for our events for the DOM events. Now, while our website is live and running, we can actually use jQuery to add new elements on the fly. Now, for example, if I selected my H1 and I decided to add a new button before the H1, then I simply use the before method, and inside these parentheses, I can put down the HTML that I want to add before our H1. So let's create a button that simply says new, and let's create the closing tag. And now if I hit enter, you can see that we've created a brand new button on our web page without changing any of our HTML code inside Atom. So that means that we can create HTML elements at any time we wish just by using code. But there's actually a few ways that you can do this. So previously I showed you how you can use the before. Now there's also after, which creates our HTML elements after the element that we've selected. So in this case, it creates it here after our H1. Now there's also prepend and append. And the difference between, say, prepend and before is that prepend will add your new HTML element into the item that you selected just after the opening tag. So if you go ahead and inspect on this new button, you can see that it's been added inside the H1 just before the word hello. And the button that we appended got added just after the content of the H1, but before the end of the H1. So using before, after, prepend, and append, we have a lot of control over where our newly created HTML element is going to go. So just as a reminder, the before method will add your new element before the opening tag of the selected element. So in this case, it was our H1. And the after method will add it after the H1. But the prepend and append are a little bit special. They'll add your element just before the content of the H1 and right after the opening tag. And append does the opposite, where it gets added after the content of your H1, but still inside the H1 element. Now, if you wanted to remove elements, it's also really, really simple. All you have to do is just use our $sign to select the elements that you want to remove. For example, say if we wanted to get rid of all of our buttons, then we can simply select all of them and say .remove. And that will get rid of all of the button elements inside our current web page. Now, jQuery also makes it really easy to implement some common animations that you might want to do when you're creating your website. So let's head into Atom, and inside our index.js, at the moment, we've got a click listener on all of our buttons that changes our H1 CSS to the color purple. Now, if we were to delete this method, so instead of using .css, we use something like .hide. And this method is an animation that will hide the selected element. So when we click any button in our web page, it should try and hide the H1. So let's see what that looks like. Let's refresh the page and you can see that our H1 disappears when I click on any of the buttons. Now, if we wanted to show that H1 instead, we would have to select our H1 and say .show, and that will make it reappear. Now, if instead of only making our H1 hide and disappear forever, we wanted to toggle the hide and show, then we can simply say toggle. So now, when I click on any button, it'll hide my H1, and then when I click on any other button, it will show my H1, and I can toggle its appearance by clicking on my buttons. Now, hiding is a very sudden kind of event. It disappears and the element gets removed from the flow of our HTML, so everything else moves up. And this is a very sudden sort of disappearance and appearance. Now, if we wanted that to be a little bit more progressive, then we can use something called fade out instead. And you can see that when I click now, it'll reduce the opacity of my selected element and then it will hide it. And of course, fade out has its related opposite, which is fade in. And that will make our H1 appear and also fade into full opacity. Now, all of these methods come with a toggle option. So fade toggle will allow our buttons to fade out, then fade in, then fade out. I can do this all day long. All right, so in addition to fading and hiding, you can also use a slide up and slide down. And what this does is it kind of just collapses our element that was selected. And slide down will just uncollapse that element. And again, slide up comes with slide toggle. So this will just slide up, slide down, slide up, slide down. And this can be really useful if you have something like a drop-down menu, for example. Now, if you wanted more fine-grained control over your animations, then instead of using these pre-built ones, you can use something called .animate. And this allows you to define some custom CSS that you want to gradually animate towards. So inside the parentheses, we can insert a set of curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we're going to add our new CSS rule that we're going to animate to. So for example, I can change the opacity of my selected element to only 0.5, so 50% of its previous value. So now if we hit save and refresh and I click on one of these buttons, you can see that my element just got a lot more transparent. And it might be a little bit easier if I change the color to something a bit more easy to see, like say purple. You can see that clearly makes the opacity much, much lower. Now, the thing to remember about the animate method is that in between the curly braces, you can only add the CSS rules that have a numeric value. So that means that you can't animate to something like a color, right? You can't change the color to red. And when I run this, you can see that we get an error. Red is not defined. And this is because it's very difficult to create that kind of tween animation that gradually progresses from one style to another using the animate method. So you have to stick to things that have a numeric value. For example, a margin of 20 pixels, that it can do. Or if you wanted to make it a percentage, then you can include it as a string. So 20% margin, which makes it much bigger. But essentially, make sure that the second value in the CSS that you're trying to animate to is a number value. Now, if you wanted to have more than one of these animations happening, then you can chain them together. So what do I mean by chaining? So for example, if we wanted our H1 to slide up, but then after it's slid up, I then want it to slide down. And after it's slid down, I want to change the CSS to have an opacity of 0.5, so 50%. So essentially what we've done here is chained 3 methods together so that we target our H1 and first get it to slide up, then slide down, then animate. Now remember that if this is all targeting the same thing, it can't slide up and slide down at the same time. So it will do it in order. So let's check it out. Slide up, down, and change opacity. So that's pretty cool, right? And if you're worried right now that you can't remember what all of these methods are called or how to use them, then don't worry. As programmers, we try to save the sacred space that is our brain. So never try to remember or memorize anything. That's not what it's about. Essentially for me, programming is basically like an open book exam. And nobody memorizes things for open book exams, right? You just try to understand what's going on. Because remember that there is always the documentation and the whole World Wide Web out there to help you in the exact moment that you need the information. You just need to know that they exist and roughly what they were called or what they're able to do. So for example, if we couldn't remember how to use slide up, then we could search for something like, so we know it's about jQuery, and we know that it was an animation, and we know that we needed to slide something, right? So let's hit enter, and you can see that we've already got access to our slide down event. And if we looked a little bit further upstream, then we can see all of our effects. Animate, delay, fade in, fade out, fade to. And this is the jQuery's documentation, which is searchable on here on jquery.com, but it's actually much easier to just search through Google because it gives you the most relevant results. And it might give you the W3 scores or the MDN, but jQuery is extensively documented. And even if it's not in the documentation, somebody would have already asked a question on Stack Overflow, or somebody will be able to help you on Stack Overflow with your questions. So never memorize, always remember that all the resources that you need are just a few keystrokes away. Now, I hope you're ready for a challenge because I've got a big challenge for you. This is definitely a boss level fight. Now, we're going to create a game using jQuery. And in the process, you'll be able to consolidate what we've learned in this module and reassure yourself that you've absorbed all of this information. So once you're ready, head over to the next module for your boss level fight. Hey, well done. Thumbs up for yet another module that you've just gotten out of the way. I want to talk to you a little bit about, again, how we learn, because it's like the thing that completely fascinates me, how human brains are able to process like the inputs and make the connections in your brain. Now, one of the sort of topics of research that I've been reading a lot about is this idea of mixing different areas of knowledge. So, for example, in programming, let's say in one of the modules you were learning about conditional statements, if and else, and another part you were learning about loops, like for loops or while loops. Now, if you just learn all of those things in, like a capsule, right, where you just learn one thing and you only use that one thing, then the connections that you make in your brain are not as strong as if you had been able to mix up these concepts and somehow use them together. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you've got one module where you learned a particular topic, another module where you learned a different topic. If you can come up with a program or some bit of code that mixes two things from those two modules together, even if it's not particularly grand, it's not like some sort of huge piece of software you're making, just like a small bit of code, like 5 or 10 lines of code, but it uses two different parts of knowledge from different parts of the course, then you're already starting to solidify your knowledge, right? So see if you can use these ways of mixing up, like something that you learned in module 3 with something that you learned in module 5, and try to cobble those things together and see if you can use them within the same context. So try that out and let me know how you get on.
Ok, donc on vient de finir la section 19. On va rapidement faire la section 20, mais vous allez remarquer que c'est juste des documents, hein. Donc, ce qu'on va faire, on va juste checker et puis on va voir la vidéo qui explique cela à la fin. On va donc le faire tout de suite devant vous. Donc, on va faire ça. Hop.
Hello, and welcome to your challenge. So, in this challenge module, you will be building a game that is modeled off the game Simon. So, the way that it works is that you can press any key to start, and it will show you a tile that you have to click on. And as you go from level to level, the patterns get more and more complicated. And at some point, you're going to screw up, and it's going to tell you that you got it wrong and game is over. So, you can press any key to restart the game. So this is going to be a challenge, but it's also going to be really, really fun, and it's going to test out your skills and what you've learned in the last module on jQuery, as well as some of the modules that we have tackled previously. So once you're ready, head over to the next set of lessons where you'll find the instructions as well as the starter code for your challenge. So I wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey, it's Angela here again, and I'm here to give you a virtual pat on the back for getting this far and completing the last module. Now, today I want to talk about what you should do when you feel really frustrated, like when you feel overwhelmed with all the things that you need to know and they all seem impossible and you're getting stuck on thing after thing and you just feel like frustrated. What should you do? The first thing you should do is take a break. You've probably been staring at that piece of code for too long. And, sometimes when I stare at my own name, for too long, it starts looking weird. Is that really how you spell Angela? A-N-G-L, if you are not getting a moment to just let your brain think about something else, it will get stuck much, much easier. So take a break, sometimes sleep on it. The best solutions come to me when I think about my problem before I go to sleep. And then the next morning I wake up and I try to tackle that thing that I got stuck on yesterday. For some miraculous reason, it's as if my brain is working on it while I'm sleeping. But the next day, solutions come to me just so much easier. So take a break, let your brain rest, go and exercise, go for a jog around the block or, fast-paced walk if you're not really into jogging like I am. I try to go for a 30-minute swim at the local pool if I can. And just the sort of silence underwater when I'm swimming and just being enveloped by water somehow really helps me clear my thoughts, and it makes me feel more calm, and when I come back to my problem I just seem to be better at solving it. So don't be so hard on yourself. Don't just sit there and rip your hair out and be why can't I do this? Why is my code not working? We've all been there before, but it's not the right thing to do. Take a break, have a moment to yourself, think about something else, look at something else, and then come back to it. It's always going to be there for you. Your problems don't run away.
On vient de finir la section 20, qui était une section tout simplement d'exercice, hein. Tout ce qu'il faut retenir de là, c'est que il faut juste se concentrer sur en fait, le dernier step, le dernier step qui va résumer tout le projet. Donc, il faut télécharger le projet ici, je crois. Non, non, désolé, ici je me trompe. Donc, c'est ici, Download the Complete Project. Donc, ici, vous pouvez télécharger tout le projet complet, puis le télécharger en étapes. Ça vous permettra de voir à quoi consiste le projet. Voilà, et de l'analyser pour résumer un peu à quoi consiste le chapitre sur jQuery. Donc, on vient de finir, on va passer aux notions de Unix, command line, et on commence tout de suite.
Alright guys, in this lesson we'll go through the installation steps to install Git Bash and Git on Windows. Mac already comes with Bash pre-installed, so if you're working on a Mac, you can skip this lesson and head over straight to the next lesson. Now, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to navigate to Git for Windows and you're going to download the Git SCM. Now, once that's downloaded, go ahead and open up the installer and select Yes. And then you're going to agree to the license by clicking Next. Select the location where you're going to install Git. On this next step, where it asks you to select which components should be installed, make sure that this checkbox next to Git Bash is selected and is checked as yes. Now go ahead and leave the defaults for the rest and click Next. And then leave the default Git as the folder and click Next. And then keep clicking Next and going with the default selected options. Select Next and Next and Next. And just basically keep selecting Next and keeping the default selections from the installer. Now, once installation is completed, let's make sure that it works. So let's open up VS Code and open up a terminal. And you can find that on the top menu. Click Terminal, New Terminal. And then in this new terminal, click on that drop-down button next to the plus sign and select Git Bash.
Donc, je pense que moi, je l'ai. Donc, si j'ouvre mon truc, et puis je vais encore dire, Je vais dans terminal, new terminal, new terminal. C'est comme ça et on vérifie ici. On va voir qu'il y a un git bash. Et si je fais git bash ici, git bash, on verra que j'avais installé git bash. Donc on est bon à ce niveau.
Now you should see something similar to this with a $sign in the terminal. Now, in order to configure VS Code to make Git Bash your default shell, we have to go to the command palette, and we can find that by going to View, Command Palette, and then in the command palette, we're going to search for Select Default Profile, and once that comes up in the dropdown, select it, and then select Git Bash. And this is going to set it so that every time you open up a new terminal, we're working with Git Bash as the selected terminal. So let's try it out. Let's click close down that terminal, select a new one, and you can see Bash showing as the profile for our terminal. And there you have it. That's all you need to do to set up Git Bash. Set it so that every time you open up a new terminal, and once that comes up in the dropdown, select it, and then select default. We're going to search for select. And then in the command palette, we're going to search for select the command palette. And we can find that by going to View, Command Palette. And then in the command palette, we're going to search for select default profile. And once that comes up in the dropdown, select it, and then select Git Bash. And this is going to set it so that every time you open up a new terminal, we're working with Git Bash as the selected terminal. So let's try it out. Let's click close down that terminal, select a new one, and you can see Bash showing as the profile for our terminal. And there you have it. That's all you need to do to set up Git Bash on Windows. And in the next lesson, we're going to learn what the command line is all about, what Bash is all about, and why it's useful. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there on the next lesson. All right, guys, in this module, I'm going to teach you something really, really cool and really useful as well for any technology, web development or back-end development. The command line is going to be your friend. So what is the bash shell? Well, to understand the bash shell, we first have to know what a shell is. And this graphic is a good way of tackling that. If you think about your operating system as a pistachio nut, then the kernel, so the actual pistachio, the thing that you're going to eat, I'm really sorry about all the food analogies. You can clearly tell I'm pretty much hungry most of the time when I'm recording these videos. But let's get back to the topic. If your operating system is a pistachio, then the actual nut is the kernel. And in computing, the kernel refers to the actual program that interfaces with the hardware. So it's the core of your operating system. Now, the shell in computing refers to the user interface for you as a human to be able to interact with the kernel and in turn with the hardware of your computer. And there's two variants to the shell. There are graphical user interface shells. So for example, when you open up Finder, you're using a graphical user interface to access and find your files. But there's also a command line interface, which is what we're going to be talking about and what we're going to be learning about in this module. So this is an alternative way of interfacing with the kernel. Now, it can seem intimidating at first, but I want to show you that it's actually super simple. And once you understand it, you're going to see that it's actually a really, really useful tool at your disposal. Coming back to the shell that we're going to be using, which is a bash shell, and it stands for the Born Again shell, and it's named after a Mr. Bourne, but not this Mr. Bourne, but this Mr. Bourne, and I can attest that they are equally badass. And the Born Again shell, or the bash shell, is a CLI, or a command line interpreter for the Unix system. And you find Unix-based systems or Unix-like systems all over the place. So for example, Linux is a Unix-like system, and a lot of servers will run on Unix, and even Mac OS X, or the newly named Mac OS, runs on a Unix-like operating system. And this is a completely different family from the Windows side of things, which uses DOS and Windows. A lot of things that you can do with the command line can be done using the graphical user interface. So why use the command line at all? At the end of the day, what it all boils down to is about greater control. And in your journey of becoming a better developer, you will need to understand and exert more power over your tools, that is the computer hardware. But on a more day-to-day basis, you will find that if you're a regular command line user, that it's actually easier and faster to do a lot of really common things. For example, inside the terminal, if I wanted to make a music folder, then it's as simple as make dir music, and Now there it is, there's my music folder. But if I want to do inside Finder, for example, I first have to go to Finder, I have to navigate to my desktop or whichever directory I want to create it inside, and then I have to maybe right-click, new folder, and then type something like music, right? And that takes a lot of effort. Whereas, say if I wanted to create music 2, right, make another folder, it's as simple as hitting the up arrow and hitting 2. So for me, it's a lot about speed and a lot about control. The other thing that you'll notice about a lot of these graphical user interfaces is they try to hide a lot of the complicated stuff or the unnecessary stuff, like configuration files, from the common user. And the idea is that, unless you know how to deal with it, then you probably shouldn't be dealing with it. But with the command line, you have full control and you have a lot of flexibility. So, for example, on my desktop, you can only see one folder with no files called app development, right? So I'm on my desktop at the moment inside Finder. But actually, if you use terminal, you can actually list all the files. And if I just add this -a flag, you can actually see that I've also got a folder called secret stuff. And you can create these hidden folders by simply writing make_dir.say secrets. And now if I list again, I've now got 2 secret folders. And later on, when we're going to teach you Git and version control, we're going to be using the command line really heavily to show you the easiest and probably the most popular way, amongst developers at least, of using Git and version control. So I hope I've sold you on the virtues of the command line. So without further ado, let's get started learning how to use it, what are some of the most common commands, and some tips and tricks as well. The first thing you're going to do is open up your terminal. So the first thing that you might notice is that my preferences or my display or the skin on my terminal might look different from yours. Now I have it this green on black just because I do a lot of development at night and it helps my eyes and it helps me going to sleep afterwards. And also there's the added benefit of when you're sitting in Starbucks and doing a lot of bash scripting, people look at you really funny, like you're going to hack into their phone or something. And if you really want to take it to the extreme and you've never seen this website called hackertyper.com, then you can actually pull it up on your browser and you can basically just bash the keys and you look like you're writing some insane piece of code. This is actually part of the Linux kernel in case anybody's interested, and it's written in the C programming language. So that also is something that you can impress your friends. Now, coming back to our actual lesson, let's talk about the first command that we're going to learn today, which is ls, which stands for list. And this lists all the items inside a particular directory. So you can see the location of where you are by whatever shows up here. So at the moment, this tilde shows me that I'm in my user directory. So that in the Finder world is basically here. So the root or the highest level in the hierarchy is your Macintosh hard drive. And then the next one is your users folder. And on this computer, my username is Angela Yu. And when you see that tilde sign, you are at this level. You are inside this folder right now. If I wanted to list all the items that are inside that folder, then I simply write the ls command and hit enter. You can see it prints out all of the folders and files. So I've only got folders inside my root directory, and you can see that it's exactly the same as what you see in Finder. Now, what if you don't want to be inside this folder? What if you want to navigate to a different directory, right? Say, for example, if I wanted to go into my documents and I want to go into learn, and I've got this folder called languages. And right now I'm learning German and the International Phonetic Alphabet, in case anybody's interested. So how do I get myself from here all the way inside here? Well, this is where the change directory or the cd command comes in handy. We know that we are here right now because of the tilde sign. Let's navigate one level down. Let's go into our documents folder. So I can simply write cd documents. Now I can type out the entire thing myself, but as a developer, we're always looking for lazier ways of doing things and faster ways of doing things. So if you start typing doc and you hit tab, you can see that the terminal will autofill the remainder of your folder name. Now you need enough letters for it to know what you're talking about. So for example, if I just wrote do, then it will tell me that there's documents and downloads. Which one do I want? So if I add a W and then I hit tab, then it knows that it can only be downloads, for example. Okay, so let's change directory to documents. And you can see that the location has changed. This directory name is now saying documents. So that means I am currently inside here. I am at this level. So if I wanted to go into this level, I would have to navigate into the learn folder. So if you're following along, what would you type? Give it a go. Similar as what we did before, we're simply writing cd learn. and hit enter. So now we're inside learn. Now it's a little bit tedious to navigate through directories one by one by one, right? If we already knew that we want to go all the way into here, then we can actually specify the entire path to get there. For example, right now I'm inside learn. Let's go back to our root. So I can say cd tilde and hit enter. And now I'm back at my root directory, which is here. Let's map out the path that I need in order to get to here. I need to go into documents and then learn and then languages. So I can simply write cd documents, learn, languages. And now if I hit enter, I am inside languages, which is over here. And that's a lot more succinct and a lot quicker than going through the directories one by one. Another really time-saving feature of Terminal is the up and down buttons. So if you wanted to use the last command that you typed, all you have to do is just hit the up button. And you can see that I can use that change directory command again. But in my case, I actually want to use the ls command. Obviously, it's easier to simply type out ls rather than cycling through all those, but I just want to show you that you can actually go through your entire history of previous commands, and you can then hit enter to execute it. And you can see that inside the languages folder, I have two other folders called German and IPA. So you can tell that we are at this level in our directory. Now, sometimes typing out an entire path like this might seem like it's a lot of work. So I want to show you another neat trick that you can use when you have the Finder open and you just want to navigate to a deep directory without having to type out the entire path. So let's cd back to here, to our root directory for your user. Do you remember how to do that? If you do, go ahead and do it now. So I'm going to cycle back and I found it. It's the cd tilde. And if I hit enter, I am now back at my user's root directory. Now, once we're inside this languages folder, how do we change directory back to the parent folders? How do we go backwards in this path? We're still going to be using the change directory or the cd command. And then after a space, we're simply going to type 2 dots. And this takes us back one level. So from languages, I'm now in the learn folder. So I'm now here. And I can keep doing this until I'm back at my root directory right here. So it took me 3 cd dot dots to get back to my root. And the reason why you might want to do this is because, say if I was inside the languages folder, so I'm now at the languages directory, and I wanted to navigate now to my music directory, for example. I can't simply write cd music. That's not going to work because it's looking inside this languages folder. It's looking to go forwards. So if I wanted to go backwards in the directory, I would have to specify the entire file path to go backwards. And I can only specify just the name of the folder if I'm going forwards in terms of this hierarchy. Now, what if I wanted to edit this at some point in the middle of this entire command? Because you can see that if I click at any of these places, it doesn't really do what you expect it to do in a graphical user interface, right? Namely, allowing you to edit these parts. Your cursor is here and you can only type where your cursor is. So you can of course use the left arrow to go all the way back, but this is obviously very time consuming, especially if your command is very long. So a neat trick is holding down the Option or the Alt button and it gives you this little plus sign, and now you can click on one point in your command and you can now move the cursor to that position. So that's quite a neat trick as well. Now, for people who have come from a long history of using graphical user interfaces, such as, your Mac OS or your Windows, having these little tricks like using the Option click can be quite neat. But if you are a puritanical command line user, then ideally you're aiming for never having to touch the mouse. And you can do most things that you would want to do with the mouse very easily and quickly just using your keyboard. For example, if I wanted to go to the beginning of this line, then I can simply hold down Control and press A. So my cursor is now at the beginning. And if I hold down Control and press E, then I go to the end of my command line. Now you've already seen that I can cycle through my previous commands by using the up and down button. But what if I wanted to clear this current command without executing it? So to do that, you can again hold down Control and hit the U button, and that clears your entire line. So you can write a new command. So in the next lesson, we're going to cover directories, making directories, and secret folders. So I will see you there. All right, so in this lesson, I want to introduce you to directory creation, file creation, and directory manipulation. And we're going to be doing all of this inside the command line, just with our keyboards. Now I'm starting in my root directory over here, and I am going to create a new folder right here. Obviously, I can go through the right click, new folder, all of that, but we are pro developers now, so we're going to get used to using the command line. So the command is make dir or make directory, and then we're going to give our directory a name. So let's just call it Angela, right? You can see, there you go, pops up a new folder called Angela. Now let's cd into this new directory, and you can see that if I click on here, or if I use ls, that there's absolutely nothing in there. It's an empty folder. So what if I wanted to create a file? In our graphical user interface, I could say open up an application like TextEdit, and I could make a file and write something in it and then save it inside my new directories. Do a little bit of navigating in order to get there, and then I have to give my file a name. Let's call it text and hit save. Now we have to exit the application, and after all of that work, I've got a text file. And if we do ls now, you can see that text.rtf exists. But if you want to do the same thing using the command line, then it's as simple as simply typing touch to create a new file. And then we're going to specify the name of the file. Let's call it text2. And then we give an extension, .text. And you can open it either by double-clicking on it, which is what we're used to, or you can simply write open text2, and it will open it using the default application, which is TextEdit in a Mac. Now you can specify which application you want to open this file in, and all you have to do is say open, and then you're going to use the -a flag. Then you're going to specify the application that you want to use, and then I can specify the file that I want to open, so text2.text, and hit enter, and it will open up the application that I've got, and then open up my file for me to be able to edit. So what if you wanted to delete files inside the command line? Currently, I'm inside the Angela folder, and there are 2 files, and I want to delete my text.rtf. Then all you need to do is just use the rm command, which removes files if you type the command as is, so just rm. And then we're going to specify text.rtf to remove, and once I hit enter, you'll see it disappear also in the Finder as well. Now, what if I want to remove all the files inside a folder? So let's create some more text files. So let's call it text.text, and then let's create text3.text. So now I've got text2, text3. A little bit of a tongue twister there. And I want to remove all of them. To do that, you have to be inside the directory that you want to remove all the files from. And if you want to know which directory you're currently in, you can either look at the part that's before your username and prompt. So in this case, I'm inside a folder called Angela. But you can also use the pwd or print working directory command. And then when you hit enter, it tells you your entire path and your current folder location. And now I want to remove all of them in one go without having to type remove text.text, etc. Again, we're using the remove command, and then we're simply going to use the asterisk as a wildcard, which matches everything that has every single name. And now if I hit enter, you can see that all my 3 files inside my current directory are removed. So do you remember in the beginning of this module, we mentioned that using the command line gives you more power, more control. And as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. And that means that you have to be careful when using certain commands because the graphical user interface isn't there to protect you. So for example, if you were not inside the directory that you wanted to delete, say if you were inside your root directory and you tried to remove all the files inside your root directory, then it's probably not such a great idea. So always check which location you're in before you're doing some of these destructive commands. Now, to remove folders or remove directories, there's a different command. So now I want to remove this Angela folder that I've created, and I'm inside the right place to do it. I'm inside my root directory, which is at this level. And again, always check where you are by using the ls command. You can see that I am at this level. So now I want to remove this Angela directory. And if I just simply write remove Angela, and I hit enter, you can see it says that Angela is a directory. So this remove command by itself is not going to work. To do it, we actually have to add a flag, which is the -r flag. So this allows you to remove a directory. So now let's try that again, remove -r, and then we're going to use the Angela directory. And if we watch over here and I hit enter, you can see that that directory is now gone, including all the files that it held, all the folders that are inside the Angela folder, and it removes all of its child components. Again, these are destructive commands. Be really careful when you're using them. And in fact, there's a pretty hilarious bit of internet history, which is where somebody submitted a question to Stack Exchange Server Fault, which is similar to Stack Overflow, but it's more for sysadmin and network admins. So what he said was, Monday morning mistake, He used the sudo command, which stands for super user do, which uses your admin privileges to basically allow you to do things that are probably a little bit dangerous. And he used the remove command and then the -rf flag. So we've already seen the -r, which allows you to remove entire directories and all the folders and all the child folders it contains. He also used the F flag, which stands for force. So this doesn't ask you for a confirmation. And then the very last thing, which is something that you should probably never ever write, and there's very few cases where this is actually useful, which is the no preserve route. And what that means is that along with everything else inside this command, it basically wipes your hard disk to the point where you cannot recover it. Now, this guy said, Monday morning mistake, I basically just wiped my entire server, which obviously contains data from other people who are using his server. And what do I do? So as it turns out, this is actually a hoax where this guy is trying to advertise his server company. And I mean, it's clever, or is it not clever? I'm not sure that it's positive PR, but it got a lot of attention on the internets. So if you're interested, you can have a read of this and I'll link to it in this lesson. But basically, if you have a look at the answers, you can see that this is something really bad to never do. So with great power comes great responsibility. And in this module, I've introduced you to some of the most common commands that you're going to be finding yourself using, and also some of the most common shortcuts. And if you want to learn more about the command line, then this is a website that I highly recommend. I have nothing to do with them. It's just something that I found to be written quite well. So it's completely free, and it's called the Command Line Tutorial. Learn enough command line to be dangerous. Again, the title is repeating what we just said before, but it goes into more depth, like grepping, curl, all of those things that you might have come across, and you will certainly come across more of it in your journey as a developer. Hey, thumbs up for completing another module. Now, today I want to talk to you about the importance of sleep. I know I'm laughing as I say it because it sounds like such a silly thing, right? Who doesn't know how to sleep? But actually, there's a lot of things I've tried over the past few years that have really helped me. Firstly, when I was working in medicine, when I was training in surgery, the sort of consensus that people told me is look, if you're going to be hardcore, if you're going to be really good at your job, you have to be good at being sleep deprived. People would show off how oh, I only slept for 2 hours yesterday. And actually, at the time I was really impressed. I was like, wow, they're so hardcore. They work really hard and they don't sleep and they have more hours. But as time has gone on and as I've found more objective measures of my sort of brain performance, I've realized that this is such a silly way to think about things. Sleep is so important. It helps your brain get rid of a lot of the sort of things that build up during the day, right? A lot of the byproducts. And it essentially helps you regenerate. So the nights when I sleep really, 2 hours or 3 hours, I really feel it the next day. I can do things that I've already learned how to do, like things by rote, but I can't do anything creative. I really struggle to learn things. I struggle to make connections in my brain. And it made me realize, what am I doing? Why am I living life like a zombie trying to attain this level of this sort of approval of people when I know that I'm a much better person. I'm also a friendly person when I sleep more. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to have an alarm that goes off about an hour before I have to go to sleep. So instead of having a wake up alarm, having an alarm that tells me, okay, it's time to wind down. It's time to switch off the screens. I've even got this red tinted glasses that I wear at home when I'm looking at something, if I have to watch something with other people. And just wind down with just wind down with a fiction book of some sort. So that once I'm actually in bed, I'm fully calm and I'm not so agitated that it takes me ages to fall asleep. Other things that really help is drinking some warm milk, having a little snack before I go to sleep. But the importance of sleep is there's nothing that beats it, really. There's no supplement that I've ever taken or any sort of medication or anything else basically that lives up to what sleep can do for you. So don't try to be hardcore, try to get enough sleep and try to keep a regular rhythm so that the next day you're actually fresh and the thing that your brain learns, it actually keeps, rather than just, you might be able to cram stuff, but you probably won't be able to hold on to that knowledge or skill unless you have really good sleep. So try that out and keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, and you're going to do great.
Florian, on vient de finir la section 21. On va aller sur le backend web development maintenant avec la section 22. Là, je suis à 1h24 minutes de vidéo. Donc, je pense qu'on peut faire la section 22 et la section 23 pour aujourd'hui. On y va pour la section 22.
Hey guys, well done. You've made it through the first half of the course. In this second half, we're going to be talking about the back-end side of web development and learning and writing all the code that takes care of all the behind-the-scenes functionality. So recently I came across a tweet by Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, and something he said really stuck out to me. If you think about it like this, the amount of equity you get in a startup decreases exponentially as your employee number increases. So if you wanted to get rich from a startup, you have to be there early. And in a typical tech startup, the thing that matters early on is programming. So if you're a lawyer or an MBA or biz dev, you're probably not going to be one of the first 20 employees. Instead, you're probably going to be a programmer who's really good at building stuff. So what does that mean, somebody who's really good at building stuff? Well, I took a look at the Y Combinator job board, which advertises jobs for the Y Combinator startups. And this is just a list that came up. And if you look at it, all of them pretty much want full stack web developers. What exactly is a full stack web developer? Well, it's the combination of knowing about how to work with the front end, so the client-facing side, and also how to work with the back end, which is the side that's invisible to the user, but contains all the logic that makes a web application work. And this is the part that we're going to be learning about in the coming lessons. Now, I love this cartoon that describes exactly what is the difference between the front end and the back end. Notice that here is our user, and he's looking at this beautiful mermaid, and everything the user can see is a part of the front end. It's the font, it's the colors, it's the typography, it's the buttons, the forms, everything that the user can see or hear or interact with is a part of the front end of the website. Now, what about this dragon at the back? Well, because the back end is the part the user will never see and never interact with, sometimes it can get a little bit monster-like, but it doesn't have to. And we're going to learn all the things that's going to make our front end as great as our back end. But essentially, the back end is the part the user never gets to interact with and never gets to touch or see. So what exactly is the backend? Don't worry, it's not anything rude. It consists of three main components. It's the server, which is basically just a computer, the application, which is all the logic that enables the web app to function, and finally, a database where you can store and retrieve user data. Now, let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned before, a server is just a computer. And a server for a live website should be on 24/7 so that it can listen for incoming requests from browsers from all over the world. Traditionally, servers are made and optimized for this particular purpose. But at the end of the day, any computer that is connected to the network can act as a server. And in fact, when we're going to be building our websites locally, we're going to be using something called localhost, which means we're going to be using our own computer as the server in order to serve up the websites that we create. And even though it's not on 24/7, or maybe you keep your computer on 24/7, it doesn't matter because we only need it to be on and connected when we're testing it. The second aspect of the backend is the application. And the application is basically logic that runs on that computer, the server. And this logic determines how you want to respond to the requests from the browser. Depending on what that request is, let's say a user clicked on a button and that request came through the server to the application. Well, the application knows that that particular button should then return a particular HTML page. So then it sends that HTML page back to the browser and the user gets to look at a new web page. Sometimes an application can also respond with different things other than HTML. So it could send back data, or it could send back just a status code. And you've probably all been on websites where you've seen the status code that is a 404. And this is a code that the application on a server sent back because it's trying to tell the browser that that particular request you sent is invalid. And what that means is the application does not know how to respond to that particular request the browser made. So maybe you try to go to a weird URL that doesn't exist, or you try to click on something that's broken. But either way, when the application doesn't know what to do with the request the browser is sending over, it will send back an invalid, which is a 404 status code. And then usually your website will just show the user, oops, I think you did something wrong. The final aspect of the backend is the database. And this is not a requirement of web applications, but usually as your web app gets more complex and larger, then it's going to need to start to store user data. And that is what databases are for. So when we store the data onto a hard drive, it's kind of like saving your Word document, right? If suddenly the power went out and you didn't save your work, then you will probably lose it. But if you hit save, even if the power goes out, the next time you log on, you'll still be able to see your work. And this happens exactly the same way on a server. If that computer lost power and you didn't have any sort of database, then all of that data will get completely wiped unless we have a way to persist the information. So you can view the database as a form of permanent storage for your web application. Now, I keep talking about this idea of a web application, and the reason for that is because so far what we've been building, websites that only have a front end, they are essentially web pages. They are bits of HTML that gets requested from the browser to our server, and the server then returns that HTML file which gets rendered on the browser. So it could include the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And this is why we've been able to use GitHub Pages to serve these static web pages, because all we needed to do was to store these files somewhere. And when the user requests it by going to a particular URL, then the server, which in our case was GitHub Pages, then returns these files back to the browser and gets rendered for the user to see. Nothing very complex there. But when we're talking about a web application or a web app, then in this case, it should be able to do something beyond just allowing users to view web pages. Let's think about a really, really simple type of web application functionality, and that is simply just allowing users to log in. Let's say the user goes to our website, our web app, and enters their email and their password, because they're trying to log into our website. Now, these two pieces of information are passed to our server in a request. Because our server is on and is listening for requests, it's able to find the application that knows how to handle the login. So maybe it'll be like a login.js file. In this file, there will be some logic that knows how to log a user in. And that logic is usually pretty simple. We could look inside our database, look for a particular email, and get hold of the password for that email. And then we can compare that password that's in the database for the user's email against the password that they sent us from the front end. And if those two pieces of data match, then we can send back via the server a response in the form of, say, the home page, right? So home.html maybe. And if for some reason it didn't match, then maybe our response would be to send them back to the login page and get them to try again with an error code. If you think about this whole flow of our web application, things are a little bit more complex. And the reason why it is more complex is because we now have a web application with logic and a front and a back end. The front end is everything the user sees. The back end is all of the things that the server, the application, and the database does in order for our website to have more complex functionality. If that's all a little bit abstract and difficult to imagine, then you can think of a restaurant as a really good analogy for this process of front end and back end. If we divide up a restaurant into a front end, which is the actual restaurant that the user or the client gets to see. And then we have all of the rest over here as the back end. Then we can start thinking about what happens when we order at a restaurant. Firstly, you enter the restaurant. Here you are, a little stick figure looking beautiful as always. And you say to the waiter, hey, I want something. So you take a look at the menu, which essentially is all of the functionality that this particular web app has, and you can You can also think of this as just all the different interactions on the website, buttons or forms, and you decide to click on a particular button, let's say, right? So you click on this button on a website, or in the case of our restaurant, you tell the waiter your order from the menu. And then what the waiter is going to do is he's going to traverse from the front end to the back end. And this is what happens when your browser sends that request to your server. The server is effectively the same as the kitchen in the restaurant. It's open 24/7, well, certain restaurants are anyways, but in this case, it's listening for the requests that's coming from our waiter from the front end, from the restaurant. And in the server, there are applications, which is basically our chefs. And what our chefs are able to do is they have lots of recipes. They know exactly how to respond to different requests from the client. So let's say in this case, the client wanted some pancakes. Well, the application, our chef, knows how to make a pancake. It has the pancake recipe. It checks the recipe. It sees, oh, we need some data from our database. If we imagine the pantry as the database of the restaurant, then what the chef or the application is going to do is going to request those ingredients or those pieces of data to process it or work with it somehow. And then at the end, it's going to send back a response to the front end. So in this case, we got some pancakes that were made in the kitchen and sent into the front of house, which is the restaurant. And in our server, that could be some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that got created or retrieved and sent over to the front end. Now, if you wanted more food or a different item, then you can again ask the waiter to make another request to your server. And this cycle of response and request between the front end and the back end is essentially how most web apps work. So the next time when you're thinking about how a full stack web application works, you can think about the client, who's a person at a restaurant who is ordering food, and that request gets relayed to the kitchen, which is the server side. And in the server, there's an application which is similar to the kitchen that prepares the order and working with the data in the pantry of the kitchen. And once all of that logic is processed, the food, the actual thing that the user should see, is then sent back to the client side, where the response is the food on the actual plate. In the next lesson, let's learn more about the actual tools and technologies that are used to build the backend of web applications. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Hey guys, now that we've learned about clients, servers, and databases, let's talk about which are the technologies that professional developers use to create these backends. So the programming languages used on the front end are pretty fixed. It pretty much has to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because these are the only things that the browser can work with. And even though we've seen and worked with some frameworks on the front end, and some common ones might be React, Angular, and Vue, these are all JavaScript frameworks. And all that they do are they act as the waiter who allows the client to interact with, ask questions about the menu, tell them that their email is inputted in an invalid format, do all of this front end display and logic. And then when our request reaches the backend, we can actually work with pretty much any programming language. Now, these are some of the most popular ones: Java, Ruby, PHP, C#, Python, and JavaScript. And the reason why the backend language doesn't really matter is because as long as you're able to use something to generate the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files to send back over to the front end, then it doesn't really matter what language you use to do that. For example, if I wanted to Google the sunniest place on earth, I could do that in Japanese, German, French, English. It doesn't really matter what language I use, as long as at the end I get the results back in a format that I can read. Now, some of the most common backend frameworks that you might come across on the internet are Rails, which is Ruby on Rails, the Java Spring framework, the C# ASP.NET from Microsoft. PHP will be using Laravel or Cake. And then there's Python, which includes Flask and Django. And then finally, there's JavaScript, which has Node. Now, the framework and language that we're going to be using and learning on the backend is Node.js. And reason number one is in the name. It is a JavaScript backend framework. And we've invested so much time learning about JavaScript in order to use it on the front end with React, also with vanilla JavaScript. And now we want to be able to reuse that knowledge of JavaScript to work with it on the back end using Node.js. That's not the only reason, though. It's not just because we already know JavaScript, so we're using Node. If you take a look at the latest Stack Overflow developer surveys, so they survey developers, in this case, 45,000 of them, and they classify them into professional developers and those who are learning to code. If we look at professional developers, the number one used framework for developers is Node.js. And this list mixes all of the frameworks, not just front-end or back-end. That's why you see React and Angular. And we're going to be covering the number one most popular framework. So if you want to build a website and you want to be able to get access to the most helpful resources, the most amount of documentation, the most amount of help online, then you're going to want to use the most popular framework. Also, if you want to get a job and you can see that the number one tool that professional developers use is Node.js, that means that most of the jobs that are asking for a backend developer or a full stack developer will expect you to know about Node.js. Now, let's look at some of the other ones I mentioned. So ASP.NET, Django, Flask, that's Python, Laravel for PHP, Ruby on Rails. These are all a lot less popular when you compare them with Node.js. And some of them don't really change in their popularity. There's always some work for people who are C# developers. There's always some work for people who work with Python, especially if you're working with a machine learning web app. Now, something like PHP, in the case of Laravel, and Ruby, in the case of Ruby on Rails, I would say are actually very much declining in popularity over the years. And definitely, if you see a web bootcamp that's still teaching Ruby on Rails in this day and age, you should probably think twice about signing up. And definitely, without a doubt, the most popular backend framework that you need to know is Node.js. And because we can't make a 500-hour course, we have to focus on one technology instead of covering all the technologies where you'll see me, old and gray, and I'm still talking about one of the other frameworks. We have to make a choice. And the choice that I've made is for ease of use, because you already know JavaScript, but also the most professionally important framework that you will be expected to know as a backend developer, which is going to be Node.js. I hope you're excited to learn Node.js, and we will start right away in the next lesson.
Donc, on vient de finir la section 23 qui introduisait la notion de backend development, où elle a expliqué en 21 minutes, et moins de 21 minutes dans notre vidéo, à quoi consistait le backend. Maintenant, on va voir le Node.js qui est très très important à notre époque, si au moment où je prends la vidéo. C'est le framework JavaScript pour backend qui est le plus utilisé en ce moment. Il est plus populaire que PHP, Laravel et beaucoup d'autres choses comme vous avez vu dans la vidéo qui vient de finir. Donc, nous commençons tout de suite Node.js. Let's go.
Hey guys, in this lesson, we're going to be learning all about Node.js, what it is, and why we're choosing to use it. So we know that we can use lots of different languages to write the backend of our web application. And we've also seen that depending on the language we want to choose, we can also find a compatible framework to go along with it. Now, why would you need a framework anyways? Why can't you just write all the code from scratch using the chosen programming language and create your web server that way? Well, in some ways, a framework is a bit like mayonnaise. You know me, I love my food analogies. So let's say you're a chef and you wanted to make some sort of recipe, and a great recipe using mayonnaise, by the way, is chocolate cake. It sounds really weird, but Google it and try it. It actually tastes really, really delicious. Anyways, now let's say you're hungry at lunch and you wanted to make a tuna mayo sandwich. You could, of course, make your own mayonnaise, but alternatively, you could also just use store-bought mayonnaise. And in that way, the mayonnaise is kind of like a framework. You need all those components, the egg and the vinegar, in order to create the end product, which is your web app, or in this case, our tuna mayo sandwich. And you could write all of your own code, or because this is such a commonly used functionality, or in this case, a commonly used condiment, you could also just get the mayonnaise framework. And in that way, a web framework provides pre-built components and structures that can be used to build an application without the need for us to write every single line of code from scratch. But when we think about Node, it's actually not quite a framework. It's an asynchronous, event-driven JavaScript runtime. Node.js is designed to build scalable network applications, and this is according to Node.js themselves, so pretty much straight from the horse's mouth. So it can't get more accurate than that. Now, what does it mean? Let's break it down. It's a JavaScript runtime. Now, what is a runtime environment? Now, the important thing to remember here is that when JavaScript was first created, it was designed to run in the browser. This means that it was impossible to use JavaScript to write any kind of program that's not a website. But Node uses the V8 engine, not this 8-cylinder V8 engine, but this V8 engine, which comes from Chromium. It's written in C and C++. It's blazingly fast, and it powers the Chrome browser. So we know that we can write JavaScript code to run in the browser and to provide functionality to our websites. But in many ways, the JavaScript code that we have is locked in the browserland jail. And when Node came along, it effectively liberated the JavaScript out of browserland and gave it the freedom to allow us to use it to write any sort of application, desktop or server-side. Now that Node provides us with this JavaScript runtime so that we can run JavaScript on a machine such as your own local computer, then it means that we can use JavaScript to accomplish pretty much anything that other popular server-side languages like Ruby, PHP, C#, Python can do, but maintaining our full JavaScript stack from front-end to back-end. Now, what about the other part of this sentence? It's asynchronous and event-driven. What does this mean? Well, essentially, asynchronous means that your JavaScript code doesn't have to do everything sequentially. If we think back to the scripts that we've written before, our code kind of runs from top to bottom, and we can have some functions, but essentially everything is going to happen from beginning to end in a synchronous way. Now, what does asynchronous mean? Well, let's say that you went onto Amazon, not that kind of Amazon, this Amazon, and you ordered yourself something. Now, if this process was synchronous, then it means that you would have to sit there and wait until your parcel gets delivered and you can't do anything else in the meantime. That's what it means to run synchronous code, such as our previous script written in JavaScript. It's effectively tying up the resources until some sort of event resolves, which in this case is the delivery of your Amazon parcel. Can you imagine a world where you had to wait for your Amazon parcel and you just had to stand at the door and do nothing else after you've ordered it? Now, I don't know what Amazon Prime is like where you live, but where I live, it takes a long time to get one of these parcels, and it would be terrible if this process was synchronous. Now, Node, on the other hand, is asynchronous and it's event-driven. So it means that you can initiate this order, and instead of having to wait for it, it can free up the resources. And only when the event of the parcel being delivered does it then continue to run the next bits of code. So effectively, we can parcel up these bits of code into an event so that we know that our code can be triggered when this event happens. In summary, the reason why we need Node is because it allows us to build an application on a computer using JavaScript. And as we saw earlier, the application is a key aspect of our backend. Now, that application is going to be running on our server. And that server, if you remember, is just a computer. But it's not a browser. And Node.js is what allows this to happen. Now, as we saw earlier, there are many, many different choices in terms of languages or technologies that we could use for the backend. So why are we choosing Node? Well, the reason is because if we use Node, which is one of the most popular choices as of today, then it means that our front end could be written in JavaScript, plus HTML and CSS, of course, but our backend could also be written in JavaScript. So effectively, that allows us to use JavaScript everywhere inside our web application. And this allows us to use one language to rule them all. So the key benefits of Node.js are the fact that it allows us to use JavaScript across the entire stack, which means that developers are using a language they're already familiar with, and it makes it easy for them to transition from front-end to back-end developer. And if you're writing a project yourself, then you only really need to be familiar with one language, and you can share your code between your client and server-side. In addition, Node.js allows for easy scaling of applications, making it really good for large-scale professional projects. It's fast and it's non-blocking, because of this asynchronous event-driven nature of Node.js, it can be really fast and really efficient instead of having to wait for things to happen or blocking the resources. Finally, it's got a huge ecosystem. It's got a really vibrant community, and people have contributed thousands of open source modules and packages to the Node Package Manager, which allows us to easily add functionality to our own applications, but also it means that there's a lot of resources out there in terms of documentation, tutorials, help, people on Stack Overflow who can answer your questions. And plus, we're not the only people choosing it. Everything from LinkedIn to Twitter to Netflix is built on top of Node.js, and even NASA uses Node.js. I recently came across this report about how NASA started using Node.js in order to keep their astronauts safe and make their data accessible. So if it's good enough for NASA, it's probably good enough for our projects. Now, I don't think you needed any more convincing why we are choosing the best possible path, but every single time I give a talk on Node.js, people always ask me, why don't we use C#? Why don't we use Python? And why don't we use PHP? And people are particularly obsessed with PHP for some reason. And as we saw already in the last video, Node is just dominant. It's the thing that you're going to need to know if you want to get a job. And it's the thing that most people will look for as a key skill in a web developer. And we're trying to become web developers, right? If you want to learn about Python and Python-based backends, which are really great if you're working with machine learning projects or anything to do with machine learning and AI, then be sure to check out my Python course where we cover the use of Flask in the backend and using Python. Now, one final piece of interesting stat from GitHub, which looks at the programming languages of code that is committed across the entirety of GitHub. And you can see that JavaScript is just still king. Python is growing in popularity. And for example, PHP, for some reason, I always get asked about this. Why are you not teaching PHP? Well, it's because it's not really a very good idea to teach you PHP at this point. And in fact, if you see any web development bootcamp that's teaching PHP or Ruby on Rails, then you should probably be asking yourself if they have updated their curriculum within the last 10 years. There you have it. You should now understand what Node.js is, what it allows us to accomplish, and why we're choosing it to build our backend. In the next lesson, I'm going to be showing you how to install Node.js on your local computer so we can get started building applications using Node. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.
Donc, je viens de vérifier si j'ai effectivement Node, en tapant Node version, et il me dit que j'ai la version 22.16. Bon, ici c'est l'installation de Node sur le Mac. Bon, là, ça ne nous intéresse pas. Sur Windows, on clique sur ce lien, je choisis cette version, moi j'ai la version 22. Ensuite le front, next, sur npm, on redémarre l'ordinateur et on check avec Node version ce que j'ai déjà fait. Voilà, donc on peut aller using objects.
So now that you've successfully installed Node, let's go ahead and see how we can use it to start creating applications. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to perform a version check using this command in the command line, node -v. Go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code and open up a new window. Now, in this new window, you won't have any files, you won't have anything else, but that's not important. We're going to go to View and we're going to open up the terminal. Now, another way to get to this is actually to hover down right to the bottom until you see this little arrow pop up And if you click and drag it up, you'll also be able to open up the terminal. I'm going to get rid of anything that I don't need. And inside my terminal, I'm going to write that command, node-v, to check the version of Node. And hopefully you're on the same version as me if you've completed all of the installation steps correctly. Now, if you don't see the same version, it might be because you are on a more recent version, so maybe the number is higher. Alternatively, maybe you've installed Node in the past and you've got a lower version for some reason or other. Have a look at the text and the FAQs in the last lesson where we did the installation, and you'll find some instructions on how to fix this. But hopefully when you check your Node version, you should see a version number show up starting with a V, and it should be 18 or higher, so 19, 20, whatever it may be. Now that we've made sure that we've got the right version of Node, the next thing to learn to use is the Node REPL. So REPL stands for read, eval, print loop, and this is not unique to Node. It's something that we can do with most programming languages. And it's basically an environment like the Node runtime environment where we can put in user inputs in the form of code, and what we write is read by the computer and evaluated line by line, and then it prints out the result back to us in the command line or in the console. And to initiate the Node REPL, all we have to do is to type the command node. Going back to our Visual Studio window, let's go ahead and type the node command. Here it should tell you welcome to Node, and you should see this little arrow here, which tells you that you have successfully entered the Node REPL. Now, in the Node REPL, what we're going to do is we can type some commands, such as the .help that they've already told you about, and this gives you some of the other commands that you can use, for example, break, clear, editor, etc. But the most important one, because very often the hardest thing with REPLs is how to exit them, we can use the .exit to get out of this, and you can see we no longer have that little arrow sign showing up anymore. That's ended. Alternatively, you can simply type Control-C and then Control-C again in order to exit. Now, Control-C is usually the way to get out of anything in the command line. So in the future, even if you see some sort of process running and you're not getting your usual command line interface, just try Control-C a few times and that should hopefully get you out of trouble. Now let's go back into the Node REPL, and I'm just going to raise this window up a little bit because I know that very often the subtitle goes at the bottom and it can be hard for students to read what I'm writing. All right, so inside our Node REPL, let's try to do a read, eval, print loop. Let's write some code. Let's do something really simple like 5 plus 8. Hit enter and you can see it's read my code, it's evaluated it, and then it's printed it out. So read, evaluate, print, loop, done. Now remember that Node is a JavaScript runtime, so you can write anything that is JavaScript. So let a equals 3, and then a plus 12 will work just as you would expect. Have a play around with the Node REPL, and hopefully by the end you'll see that this is really similar to what you've been able to do using the JavaScript console in the browser. But in this case, we've just taken it out of the browser and we're using Node to enable us to run that JavaScript code. Now, the final thing I want to show you in terms of using Node.js is how we can write a JavaScript file and use Node to run the entire file. Because as useful as a REPL is in the command line, what we actually need to do is to write full code files and to use Node as the runtime environment. So head over to the course resources in this lesson, and hopefully you'll see a zip file there called 2.1 using Node, and I want you to download and extract that file and open that folder inside VS Code. If you don't know how to access the course resources or how to unzip and actually get hold of the file and make it work, and if you've just skipped to this section, make sure you take a look at one of the earliest lessons in the course right at the beginning in section 1, where we talk about how to get hold of the course resources. It's really important, and if anything doesn't work in the next steps, be sure to review that. All right, but hopefully you've got this working, and you can see in here, all there is just a blank index.js file. But what's important is our folder structure. I want to show you how we can write code into this code file. I'm just going to write console log hello from Node. And that's all we got. Let's hit save and let's open up our terminal. And the first thing I want to do is to navigate to that folder. So remember, we can use cd to change directory, and the directory I want to get hold of is the one that contains this index.js file. So I'm going to drag that folder, 2.1 using Node, and then hit enter in order to navigate into that folder in the command line. Now that I'm here, I can use the node command, and instead of just writing node where we enter the REPL, I'm going to type in the name of my file. And one of the things that a lot of developers do when they are trying to access different files, etc., is you can actually just type the first few words, hit the tab key on your keyboard, and it should autofill the rest of the file name. On one hand, this is really great because you didn't have to type out the rest of the file name, but on the other hand, it's also a sense check for figuring out whether if you're in the right directory, because if I went up one level and I did the node index, and you can see, even if I keep hitting tab, nothing happens. There isn't a file called that in this directory. So let's go back into the folder that we want to be in, and then go ahead and use node, and then add the name of the file we want to run, hit enter, and you can see that node has found this file, used the node runtime to run the code inside index.js, and here we see the outcome, which is exactly what we would expect. There you have it. Hopefully this has worked just as well for you. And if you want some extra practice, I recommend creating another JavaScript file inside the same folder and write some code in there and use Node to run that file, just so you can have practice using Node. But in the next lesson, we're going to move on to look at some of the native Node modules and see how we can leverage them in order to add more power to our Node applications. For all of that and more, I'll see you there. In the last lesson, we created a very basic Node application, and all our application did was to console log a bit of text. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use native Node modules that will allow you to leverage existing code that's been built into Node that makes it way more powerful than just what you can do with JavaScript. What exactly are these native Node modules? Well, they're kind of like your starting toolset. Now, we mentioned before that Node had a whole bunch of features built into it, just so that it was able to make it easier for you to create applications, especially on the server side. And the code that was written in order to make this easier include things such as a file access, so reading and writing into the local file system. So that could be local on your computer, or in the case of your web application, it will be onto the server computer, as well as things such as networking in order to reach across the internet and carry out certain bits of functionality that's important for the backend of a web app, and a lot more. Essentially, you can think of these native modules as kind of like the games that come pre-bundled with your operating system. One of my favorite is Minesweeper on Windows. It's sort of endlessly entertaining, and I don't really know why. But also remember there was Pinball and Hearts and Solitaire, and you can of course install more games onto your computer, but the native ones are the ones that came pre-bundled because they thought maybe they'd be useful to entertain you or to while away the hours like I did in my childhood. Now, in the course resources for this lesson, so you can find that in the curriculum and there'll be a drop down for course resources, you should find a link to this documentation page. And this page documents all of the native modules. Now, there's a lot of them, and we're not going to go through them each one by one, because that would take years, but also that's what the documentation is for. It's more like a dictionary and not a curriculum. And some of these modules we're going to be using in the future, such as the HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol module, and maybe the path module. But right now, the one I want to show you is one of the most important and basic features of Node. And this is the file system. Remember, with native JavaScript that is run in a browser, you can't access a user's files on their computer. Can you imagine if you go onto a website and somebody is able to read and write your local file system? That is a recipe for disaster. But in the case of Node.js, because it liberates JavaScript out of the browser, we're able to use it to access, to read and write to files on the server, or in this case, to our local computer. Now, you don't have to worry about it being malicious because you're going to be the one writing all the code. So what is the file system? Well, the file system is the native Node module that allows us to access the local storage. And in order to start using it, we need to either import the code from the file system module, or we can require the bits of code that we need from this module. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about ESM, but for now, we're going to use the CommonJS pattern in order to get hold of the methods that we need from this file system module. I want you to download the starting files for this module, which is in a zipped folder called 2.2 native modules. And you're going to need to extract that folder and open it inside VS Code. If you take a look inside the index.js, you'll see it's yet another blank page. But here is where we're going to get hold of that file system module. So I'm going to create a const called fs, and this is going to be set to equal require, and the module that we need has to be entered in as a string. And you can see as soon as I put in those double quotes, it shows me all of the native Node modules that are available. It knows exactly what I'm trying to do. And the one we want is called fs, which is short for file system. So now that we've gotten hold of this module, we're going to use one of the methods in that module. And if we scroll up, you can see that there are many, many methods available, but the one that we want to use is called fs.writeFile, because this is going to allow us to take a message that's a user input or from some bit of our website, and we're able to write it into a file to be saved onto the computer. And in this case, it will be our local computer. The method that we need in order to do this is called writeFile, and this is from the Node file system module. And then in order to use this method, you can see the structure is like this. The first is the file that we want to create. Next is the data that we want to put in that file. And finally, we have the callback to handle any errors or any issues. This is the example code for how this would work. And again, notice how they've got the import format instead of the require format, which we're going to go through very, very soon in the next lesson. For now, don't worry too much about that. We're going to use this writeFile method, and we're going to pull it out of the fs module. Heading back over here, we can type fs.writeFile, and there we can access this method that we need. Now, the file I'm going to create is called message.txt, so it's going to be a text file. And because I'm not putting in a full path here, it's going to create it in the same parent folder as my index.js. Now, the next part I need to put in is the data. So I'm going to just enter a string. So let's use that previous sentence, hello from Node.js. And then finally, we have our callback. Our callback is pretty simple. It can return an error, and if there is an error, we can throw the error, and if not, we can simply console log that the file has been saved. You can either type this out, or you can simply just copy everything from here to the end of that curly brace and paste in that callback as our last parameter. This is what it should look like. And now if we hit save and we open up our terminal, let's cd over to this folder. And remember that your file path will look different depending on whether if you're on Windows or Mac, and also depending on how you organize your project structure. So don't worry if this doesn't match, just make sure that you grab hold of the right folder in the left-hand pane here. And now once you're inside that folder, we're going to use our node to run our index.js. And then let's hit enter, and it tells us the file has been saved. Success. So there were no errors, and we managed to get to our console log. Now you can see that the message.txt file that we wanted to be created got created inside the same folder. And if we open it up, it says hello from Node.js. How cool is that? So we've managed to use a native Node module. We didn't have to think about how to create these files, save it to the local system, or any of that business, because Node has created the code to enable us to do this functionality. Now, the next thing, of course, is a challenge for you. Instead of just writing to file, you can also read from a file. If you take a look at the fs.read file documentation, I want you to use the example code along with what we've written so far, and I want you to change the text inside here. So maybe you can say hello from Angela, or whatever your name is, and let's hit save on that message. And coming back here, I want you to write the code that would read that file, message.txt, take the text inside it, and then console log it into the terminal. That is your challenge. Pause the video, take a look at the documentation, and see if you can figure out how to do this. Have a go now. All right, so the method that we need is called readFile, and it takes a couple of options. One is the path to the file that we want to read, and the next is the callback for what we want to do once our file has been read. Now, if you take a look at the example here, in the callback, we can get either an error or the data that was read from the file, and we can use that data in a console log. Pretty simple stuff. Let's copy this example code and put it into our index.js. In order to access that method, of course, we need to write fs.read file, and then we need to provide the path to this particular file. Now, because it's inside the same parent folder, all we need to do is to write // and then message.txt. And then the rest of the code is pretty much already written for us. Let's hit save and make sure that you've modified the message.txt. And now all we have to do is to comment out the write file. We don't want this message replacing what we've got in here, so we don't want this to be run again. And then we want to go into our terminal and use node to run our index.js. Now you can see we've got something outputted here, but it's in the format of a buffer. Let's take a look at the documentation and see what's going on. If we continue reading, it says if no encoding is specified, so remember encoding is one of the options, then the roll buffer is returned. But we can specify the type of encoding we want the output to be. And in our case, we will want UTF-8 just to be able to output the text. So let's modify our method and add in this extra option right in here. So now we've got the location of our file, the output encoding of the contents of that file, and finally the console log and error handling. Let's hit save and let's run our index.js again. And you can see, almost just like magic, it has read our file, including the text updates that we put in there, and it's console logged it right here into the terminal. So hopefully you managed to get that right. If not, take a look inside the solution.js to see if there are any differences between your code, see if you've made any spelling errors or typos, that sort of stuff. And once you're ready, head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn about the Node package manager. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how to use some of the native Node modules. But in this lesson, we're going to expand our horizons and we're going to learn about the Node Package Manager, or otherwise known as NPM, in order to get access to the world of open source Node packages. So what exactly is the Node Package Manager, also known as NPM? Well, it's basically a place which collects modules that people have built for Node. And it's created by the GitHub organization, and it's a really great place to find code that other people have written with utilities and tools to help you with writing your Node applications. Now, if we think of the native Node modules as the toolbox that we have at home, then the NPM, or the Node Package Manager, is the place where you'll find all the weird and wonderful tools that you never thought you would need, but then all of a sudden you realize that your bathtub is leaking and you actually need to silicone the edges. Which, by the way, is not an easy job, and as a non-professional, you should not take it on. Don't ask me how I know this. NPM is kind of like a community tool library. So there are people who own weird stuff like sanders and silicone guns and all sorts of different clippers, whatever it may be. And together they've put it into a library so that everyone from the neighborhood can share and use these tools. And NPM is kind of like the code equivalent of that. It's open source, and you can search to find all the packages that other developers have created, little tools that they've written the code for that they think might be useful for other developers in the future, so that you don't have to duplicate the work and to write everything from scratch. So it's our shared code library, if you will. NPM comes pre-bundled with Node, so if you have Node installed, you will also have NPM installed. Let's initialize our first NPM project and see how we can configure our project. Go ahead and download the starting project folder, 2.3 NPM, extract it and open it inside VS Code. In the index.js, again, we have a blank file, but the first thing we're going to do to add to this project is to initialize NPM. And to do that, we first have to change directory over to this project folder, 2.3 NPM, and then we're going to use the npm command, and then we're going to add the word init. Now you can go ahead and hit enter. And this brings up the initialization utility, which is going to help us create our configuration file, which is called the package.json. It's going to ask us a bunch of questions, and we just have to type the answers. So first, it wants to know what is the package name. We will call it learning-npm. And then it's going to ask us the version, which I'll leave as the 1.0.0. So just hit enter. Description, I'm learning about NPM. Entry point is the index.js, test command will leave as empty, git repository empty, keywords empty, and maybe put your own name as the author. The license will leave it as ISC, and then finally you can see it's generated our JSON, which is the configuration file for our project, and then it's asking us whether if this is okay. We can type Y for yes and hit enter. So now there is a new file that has been created in our npm folder, and it's the package.json. So this is a way of representing our data, the JavaScript object notation. And you can see it's very similar to the way that JavaScript objects are structured, and it's just key value pairs describing all of the things that we've entered just now. This is just a configuration file, nothing magical about it. Where the magic comes in is when we start installing and using npm packages. And to install an npm package, we use the npm install command, and then we add in the name of the package. So where are these packages? Well, you can find them by going to npm.js, and here you can search for the entire world of packages, but you would kind of need to know what it is you want to do. So I want to show you a package that I found earlier, which is called silly name. And all it is just a random name generator. So you can give yourself a new name that is pretty silly, like salt follower pickle or road toad ginger. But we're going to use this silly package in order to learn some really important concepts like how to find a package, how to install the package, and then how to use it. To install any of the npm packages, you'll see the command over here. So let's copy it and let's go back to our terminal and paste that command in. Once you've pasted it in, you can see it's actually a shorthand. npm-i is short for npm install. And because you'll be using this command very frequently when you're using Node, you can simply shorten it down to npm-i. Now, in this case, we're just installing one npm package. But if you wanted more packages, then you can enter the names of all the packages you want in one go with a space in between. And you'll see me doing this in our later projects as well. But in our case, we just want to install this one package, and let's go ahead and hit enter. And once it's installed, if you check the package.json again, you can see it's inserted a new section called dependencies. So it's saying now our project, our learning npm, which is accessed through the index.js, and now depends on this npm package called silly name. And in addition, we've got a folder called node modules that's downloaded all of this code from the npm repositories for this silly name. And you can see the code this creator wrote so that we can use this functionality in our project without having to write all of this code. Pretty neat. Now let's collapse those folders, go back into our index.js, and take a look at the documentation to see how we can use this package. As usual, on the npm package homepage, you'll see some examples for how you can use it. And the first thing you can do is to require that package. So let's paste that in at the top. We're creating a variable called generate name that requires this module. Don't worry too much about the var. We're going to come back to that in a minute. The next step is to use the method called generate name that comes from this module. Let's copy this as well and paste it in. Now, in order to actually console log it, we'll need our console log. And I'm going to say something like my name is, and I'm using the string interpolation from JavaScript with the backticks either side and then the $sign and the curly brackets to insert the silly name that is generated. Let's add a full stop and add the closing semicolon, hit save. Now we are ready. We've completed our project. Going back into our terminal, let's use Node to run our index.js, hit enter, and you can see my name is Spot Runner Bison, which is not too bad actually. Wax Thunderfoot. That is a good name. Now you can see how easy it was to grab a package, download it, insert it into our project, and instantaneously gain this upgrade and be able to use the code that somebody else created for our purposes in our project. In a way, it's kind of like playing with Lego. There's all of these different Lego pieces into our project, gain this upgrade, and be able to use the code that somebody else created for our purposes in our project. In a way, it's kind of like playing with Lego. There's all of these different Lego pieces out there which other people have created or the Node team has created, and all you have to do is just to plug it into your project. And by playing and constructing all of these different Lego packages together, you can actually create something really massive and really impressive and really useful with not a lot of hard work and writing code from scratch yourself. Now, this is a good point to mention the ECMAScript modules. Remember in the last lesson when we learned about the native Node modules and I showed you the file system, when we looked at the example code for how to get hold of the package, you can see there is this toggle ESM or CJS. CJS stands for CommonJS, and this was the method using require that we used to use to get hold of Node modules, native Node modules, or even NPM modules. It was always using that require keyword. However, since version 12 of Node, we've moved on a little bit, and Node is now enabled to use ECMAScript modules. So instead of using require, we can use the import keyword. And this basically provides a standardized way of using JavaScript to be consistent on the front end and the back end. It also improves things through tree shaking and a whole bunch of crazy things behind the scenes, which we don't need to get into. But all it means for us is we can use that import keyword. In order to upgrade our project to be able to use ECMAScript with Node, we actually need to go into the package.json. Remember I told you that this package.json comes from NPM, but effectively acts as a configuration file for our project. So what we can do in here is we can find a location. So I normally like to go below this comma for main, and we can add in a string, which is called type. The type of project we're going to use is going to be module-based so that we can use our imports and use ES modules instead of using the default, which as of yet, right now is the default value, which is CommonJS. So let's change that to module and let's hit save. And let me show you how we can convert this line to use the new format. Let's go ahead and write the import keyword. And then the next thing we add here is the method or object that we want to import. And then we add the from keyword and a string in order to specify which package or module we want to get hold of this thing from. So in our case, our package is called silly name. So that's where it's going to be from. And I like to use this format where I write import space from module. And then now when I go back in here and I look for that generate name function, it gets auto suggested to me. Whereas if I do it this way, where I write generate name, VS Code doesn't actually know what the name of this method is because we haven't specified the module that it's coming from. This is just a little bit of a tip for when you need to do this. So now we can go ahead and get rid of this line and everything still works as perfect. So now I have a bit of a challenge for you and I want you to bring out the superhero. Go ahead and get rid of this line and everything still works as perfect. So now I have a bit of a challenge for you, and I want you to bring out the superhero in you. What do I mean? Well, we're going to go and find a NPM package called Superheroes. Don't worry if you can't find it. I've linked to it in the course resources. And here we've got a package that will allow us to generate a random superhero name. So your task is to install this package into your project, into that same index.js that we used before to generate the silly name. But this time I want you to console log something like I am, and then it's your superhero name. And maybe an exclamation mark, just to make it more dramatic. So that has to come out in the console log using this package. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so firstly, we're going to need to install this package. So going into our terminal, making sure we're in the right folder, let's install that module. And then once that's done, let's check our package.json to make sure that that dependency got added. Perfect. And then let's go back to our code and I'm just going to comment out all the previous code. And now I'm going to use the import to get hold of this superheroes package. Superheroes package. Import from, and then remember it's a string called superheroes. It has to be an S, it has to match the name of your package precisely. So very often I like to just paste it in. And then we need the superheroes object from that package. Import superheroes from superheroes. And then we're going to use the superheroes.random method in order to generate a random name. So let's create a const and let's set that to our name. And then we can console log I am so-and-so, which is going to be the name inserted here, add an exclamation mark, close off the line. Now I am done. Let's hit save. Let's run our code using Node. All right, now this is super important. If you at this point see this error, syntax error, cannot use import statement outside a module, this is because you might have skipped over the earlier part of this lesson where we talked about ECMAScript and how to enable it in our project. Remember, you have to go into the package.json and add this extra key value pair to set the type of your project to module-based to allow us to use the ES modules. So let's try this again. Hopefully now you've added this. And now if I go ahead and do node index.js, you can see it now works. I am John Wraith. I am Gertrude Yorks. I am Piledrive. I am Gertrude. You can see it now works. Now if I go ahead and do node in added this. And now if I go ahead and do node index.js, you can see it now works. I am John Wraith. I am Gertrude Yorks. I am Piledrive. That's a much better one. All right, so I hope you had fun in this lesson and we learned about npm packages and how to install and use them. In the next lesson, we're going to be building a project that's going to create a QR code from a URL. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. All right, guys, now you've been using the QR codes for a little bit now in some of the quizzes in the lessons. In the final project for this module today, we're going to be building ourselves a QR code generator. And we're going to be using Node.js packages to generate QR codes from any URL that we can come up with. So you know what QR codes are. It's kind of like a 2D barcode where you can scan with your phone in order to direct to any URL. Now, in order to create this project, we're going to be using two packages from npm. One is called Inquirer, and this is something that's going to allow us to get inputs from the user. And another package called qrimage, which is going to generate images as a PNG for us to save into our local file system. Go ahead and download the starting file for the QR code project, unzip the file, and extract it to open inside VS Code. Now, I'm going to open up the index.js file, and you can see there's roughly 3 to-dos that you need to complete in order to finish this project. First, to use the Inquirer npm package to get user input so that the user could type something into the terminal when you run this project. And we're going to take whatever the user typed to generate a QR image, and we're going to save that image locally. And then we're going to create a text file using the native FS Node module to save the user input so that once we're done, our project will allow us to type in a URL, and that URL will get generated into an image file, which will be saved into the same folder. And along with that image file will be a text file that contains whatever URL the user typed in. Have a think about how you might achieve this. Pause the video and give this project a go. All right, hopefully you've given that a good try and you're here to run through the solution with me together. We know the two npm packages that we need are Inquirer and qrimage. Now, you can either trust my spelling here or you can double check on npm. So I always recommend to trust but verify. And also it's important for you to see the documentation here anyways. We need to install Inquirer, and we also need to install a package called qr-image. Let's just make sure that it actually does what we expect it to do, which is a QR code generator. So now let's go ahead and install these two packages. So it's called Inquirer and qrimage. And remember previously I told you that you can actually install more than one package by adding both of their names after the install, or I for short, command. So let's install Inquirer first, and this is a awkward spelling, and I always need to double check. Let me just double check I've actually got that spelling right, because I've made this error many times. Inquirer, yeah, that looks right. And then the next one is QR, and then hyphen image, not underscore. Okay, so I've got both my packages. I've double checked they're correct. Let's hit enter, and hopefully I don't get any errors telling me that I've typed it wrong. Great, so it's added 50 packages. And those packages are now safely inside this node modules folder. Now, you might be wondering, why are there 50 packages when I just wanted to install 2 things? Well, because there's cross dependencies. So the module that we need is obviously qrimage and also Inquirer, but they, in their package.json, you can see actually have their own dependencies. So one thing depends on another, and by the end of it, we end up with 50 modules. But don't worry, it's all very lightweight, so it's not going to be a problem. Everything added together is probably going to be smaller than our image that we generate. Let's go ahead and do the first part, which is to use the Inquirer npm package to get some user input. In order to figure out how to do this, we go to the documentation. So we need to import Inquirer, and you might remember this from before, but in order to use the import function, we have to change our package.json to have the type set as module. You'll notice I'm also missing the rest of the default package.json information, and the reason is because I forgot, but also I wanted to show you this can be done after the fact. So you can either run npm init-y initially, or you can actually do this after you've installed dependencies, and it will still go ahead and add all of the extra stuff that you need. So remember, the -y means I'm saying yes to every single question in that initialization script. But if you didn't want to, you can remove that and you can set everything in the terminal if you wish. But in my case, I'm actually just going to leave it as it is. Maybe I'll add my name here as the author. But we can now safely go back to our index.js, knowing that this import is now going to work because we set the type of our project as module-based. Let's go back to the documentation to see how we should go ahead and get the user input. This is their example code, and we need to first pass a prompt to the user, and then we wait for them to give us an answer, and then we see if there are any errors to catch and to handle. If we scroll down, we'll see that the question is actually an object containing various optional values, such as the message to print or the name to use when you're storing the answer, and a lot of other things which are all optional. And then the answer is a key value hash containing the client answers in each of the prompts you pass, so you can pass multiple questions, such as in this case, where they've created a pizza ordering machine. Let's go ahead and take this sample code and paste it into our index.js. Now, first thing we need to figure out is how to pass a question into the prompt. So we know that the question is an object and it has a bunch of properties. So the one that we definitely need is to have a message, because this is the actual question that's going to be printed. Let's set the message property to say, type in your URL. And because this is a JavaScript object, we need to have the curly braces around it. And now we can define a name to use when we're storing the answer. Maybe let's just call it name, set it as URL. So we've got a question with 2 properties set, the message and the name, and we only have one prompt, so just one object. Then we're going to get hold of the answers. So let's just console log that and see what we get. Now let's go into our terminal and let's make sure we cd over to the correct project folder. So now that we're inside QR code project, let's go ahead and use node to run the index.js. Remember that trick where I said write in or inj and then hit tab, just to make sure you're in the right folder. So if it does appear, then we are in the right folder. And once I've hit enter, I've got my question here telling me to type in my URL. Let's try www.google.com. Hit enter, and the output, the next line, comes from my console log, which is the answers. So this seems to be a JavaScript object with the data that I want stored inside the name URL, which is what I defined up here. So now that we know that, we can actually get hold of that URL. So let's create a const, call it URL in lowercase, and we'll set it to answers.url. There you have it. So we've managed to get the first step completed. The next step is to use the qrimage npm package to turn the URL into a QR code image. So we've got the URL, let's work with the next package to turn it into an image. First, we're going to need to require this package. So I'm just going to paste it in here as it is from the documentation. We can fix this to use the same import as we used previously. Let's take a look through the documentation. In order to create a QR image, we need to use an object called QR from the qrimage module. And then we're going to use a method called image to turn a piece of text, which is the first input, into a QR image. And the second part can take a object where we have a whole bunch of options, such as the type of image, the size of the image, margin, etc. And you can see that it actually defaults to create a PNG, which is what we want to create. So we actually don't even need to provide this option. And then we take this QR image and then we use the FS module to write it into the file stream. These 2 lines of code seem to pretty much do what we need. So let's copy it and paste it into the part where we get hold of our answers from the user. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to delete the options because it defaults to create a PNG image. And the text that we want to turn into the QR code is going to be our URL from this step earlier. Now, once we've done that, then we're going to write it into the file and I'm going to call it qr_image.png. Now, the next thing to do is you can see we've got our require FS module here, we've got our require QR image here, and we can't actually mix the different ways of using import. So we can either use the module-based project or the other option is to use CommonJS. Now, because we've already selected module, let's go ahead and adapt our code to get rid of all these vars and use the correct modern syntax. So we're going to import something from the QR image module, and that something is going to be this object that we're using right here. And it's called QR. So if I type Q, it should already show up because I'm now looking through this module for this particular object. And if you look inside the node modules and you open up QR image, you'll see that in the library there is something called qr.js. And this is what we're tapping into in order to create our QR code. So now that I've imported that, I can get rid of this line of code. And down here, I'm now importing this QR straight from the module where it comes from. Now, this next part requires FS, and we know we can change that. We can use import to import from the FS native module, and the object that we want to get hold of is also called FS. Now we can get rid of this require and simply say fs.createWriteStream. And now let's go ahead and test our code to see if we can actually generate a QR image. So let's use the node index.js command to start our code. And here I'm actually going to type in the full URL. So https://google.com. And the reason for this is because I need to verify that QR code. I don't know if it's actually correct just by eye. So I'm going to need my phone to scan it in. So either copy a URL from your browser where you know it's correctly typed or type it out fully like we have here. And you can see as soon as I hit enter, we've got our QR image created and it's called qr_image.png, exactly how we wanted it. And it's now showing our QR image. And right now I've just checked this QR image and it takes me directly to google.com. Now, all we have left is the final part where we're going to use the FS module to create a text file to save the user input. We've already got hold of our FS module imported right up here. So down here, in addition to our QR image, we can use the file system method of fs.writefile to create our new text file. I'm just going to copy this sample code over here, and I'm going to paste it right below the other lines of code. So we're going to need fs dot to call the writefile method from the file system. And then we're going to create a file called url.txt. And the data is going to be the URL that we got over here. Now let's go ahead and hit save. And hopefully our final step should also work. And once I hit enter, we've got our QR image created and we've got our url.txt. It's saved the text that we've typed in right here. It's generated our QR image. And we've now completed all 3 steps of the project right here. Now, this project might have required you to do some digging around and getting used to reading documentation and understanding how it works. So if you got stuck, don't worry, it's all a part of the process. As long as you understand everything we went through just now and you're able to fix your code and you give everything your best effort and your best try, then you are moving forwards in your coding journey. So that's the end to this module. In the next module, we're going to be learning about a JavaScript framework called Express, and that is going to be the first step to creating our backend using Node and JavaScript. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Hey, well done for completing the last module. Today, I want to talk about something that has really helped me in my life. And it's in these moments when something is needed of me, say somebody's asking me to give a talk to 2,000 people, or somebody else who wants to fly me somewhere to teach their entire engineering team. And it's in these moments when I say to myself, oh, I can't possibly do that. That's for somebody who's much, much better than me. And it's these moments when if I just ignore that inner voice and I tell myself, you know what, I'm going to study for it, I'm going to prep for it, I'm going to make sure that I'm more ready than anybody else for this position, for this role, for this task. It's these moments that we learn and we become better. So always look out for these moments where you're doubting yourself and you're being asked to step up. If you really do step up, then I promise you are going to go so much further than if you just stayed in the same place. So keep going. And remember, I'm here to cheer you on.
Voilà, donc on vient de finir la section 23 sur Node.js. On va faire après, donc je vais m'arrêter ici, faire après SPJS avec Node.js. Merci.